Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about India's GDP growth rate, the reasons why the projections for it are being considered an overestimation, and why we don't have the proper data to calculate it. We also talk about why some prominent public health and medicine experts have criticized the government's handling of the pandemic. But first, we talk about courts. Like several other institutions, the Indian courts too are currently functioning in a limited way and are only hearing urgent cases via video conferencing. And because of this, a number of cases have gone pending. In the first segment, Apurva Vishwanath, who reports on law for the Indian Express, talks about the problems the courts have been facing right now, the kind of cases that remain pending, and the role of the judiciary in the time of such crises. Apurva, the courts right now are only hearing what they identify as urgent cases. And this is obviously due to the ongoing pandemic. Could you talk about how proceedings are taking place right now and the problems that the courts are facing?
So, before the nationwide lockdown was announced itself, many states had their own local guidelines for shutting down offices, and curfew was imposed in many parts of the country. So you had high courts and district courts which sort of had severely restricted their functioning from early March. And the Supreme Court itself, from about 25th of March, decided that it will only hear what it categorized as urgent cases. So there is no definitive list of what are these urgent cases. But usually cases which deal with issues like life and liberty, suppose someone's getting evicted tomorrow and they need to come to the court. So these sort of cases where you need an immediate relief, those are what the court usually categorizes as urgent hearings. So this is what the court does in summer vacations or winter vacations of the court. So they decided to go into that restricted mode and hear only urgent cases. But the problem really was on some days there weren't too many urgent cases. So Supreme Court on some unusual days has not had any hearings despite being a working day. So this is in a sense a first in the history of the Supreme Court itself.
So these cases, they are being heard via video conferencing. Were the courts prepared for this change?
Although the Supreme Court does have a mechanism for video conferencing, the e-courts project has been there. In fact, since 2011, the Supreme Court's developed its infrastructure to hear cases through video conferencing. But the pandemic really forced the courts to scale it up. So the court was prepared only to hear urgent cases, let's say 10 or 15 a day through video conferencing. But when they realized that it's not sustainable and they really have to scale up, the Supreme Court E-Committee did formulate guidelines, and they have now, after about 3 months, started hearing more cases. But it is still not the scale that we are used to. It's still not the pre-COVID scale.
So because these proceedings are happening online, has anything changed because of it? What kind of problems have come with this?
So two things here. Access to technology was an issue. So there were many lawyers who sort of were not prepared for this, did not have the infrastructure to entirely do it online, which is, from filing a case to appearing via video conferencing. In fact, number of high courts had to scramble because they didn't have their own software for video conferencing. So hearings were happening on anything from FaceTime to Zoom to WhatsApp video calls. Sometimes even when all of these fail, the judge would just pick up the landline and call the lawyer. So I think now it's somehow stabilized. More or less all high courts have come up with their own internal policies. But the problem really is, if you look at district courts, there is still the issue of access to these technologies. Most of our district courts don't have video conferencing, or at least just have one computer and one screen, which usually facilitate your under trial prisoners, because you don't want to bring prisoners from the jail just for a hearing. But for regular hearings, district courts are still not prepared for this sort of not having a physical court at all.
What about places like Jammu and Kashmir, where there are already internet restrictions and in most places there is just 2G working? What kind of problems has the state faced in this regard?
So Kashmir is, again, a unique situation because apart from the COVID pandemic itself, the restriction on internet speed has definitely impacted the High Court or even the district courts that are dealing with this. Like, for example, according to data from the National Judicial Data Grid, only 17 cases were filed last month, in the last 1 month, in the Jammu and Kashmir High Court. That's just 0.02% of their total cases that are filed. I mean, in a pre-COVID world, this number would definitely have been higher. And one of the reasons is that the internet speed is restricting. In fact, Justice Chandrachud of the Supreme Court, who is now heading the Supreme Court E-Committee, was asked this question in a webinar last week. But since the subject matter is being dealt with by the Supreme Court itself in a case, he declined to answer this question. But Kashmir is like a unique concern, and if video conferencing has to continue, then that needs to be looked into.
Okay, so there's a problem of internet access, and on top of that, the courts are only hearing urgent cases. So what kind of cases and how many cases are going pending because of it?
In terms of pendency, just the sheer number, if not what kind of cases, our district courts put together, we have about 3.2 crore cases that are pending currently. And the high courts itself, we have somewhere close to 40 lakh cases that are pending. So all of these cases do not get a regular listing. So what the courts are mostly hearing are fresh cases that are just filed. And if you take the example of the Supreme Court, most of these cases, at least in the first few weeks, first 4 or 5 weeks since the video conferencing mode was on, you only had public interest litigation related to the management of the COVID crisis. So you had PILs which challenged government action or PILs which wanted the court's intervention in some issue related to COVID. Like, for example, the migrants issue or testing, and a lot of these cases would come up before the court.
And you also recently wrote a piece where you talked about how a lot of cases related to sedition remain pending. A lot of cases that were filed just before the pandemic during the CAA and NRC protests, they are pending before the court. Arrests made are not getting bail because these cases are not being heard right now.
So when the court is hearing only urgent cases, and it's a court which defines what are these urgent cases. So the procedure works something like this. If you are a lawyer who wants to file a case, you have to send in a one-page document explaining the urgency. So this is first looked at by a court official, mostly a registrar, and he judges whether this is urgent or not, and then puts the file before the judge when it gets listed. So there is this double filter that operates. And because we don't have a definitive list of what's urgent, it does become a subjective process. So you have registrars saying, like, for example, last week we reported about the case of 19-year-old Amulya Lele from Bangalore, who has been in jail for over 3 months now. She was arrested in February on a sedition case, and a district court in Bangalore essentially qualified her bail application as not urgent.
In February, Amulya Lele, a student activist from Bangalore, had been attending an anti-CAA protest. And there, she took to stage and shouted, "Pakistan Zindabad," followed by "Hindustan Zindabad."
Pakistan Zindabad! Pakistan Zindabad! एक minute. Hindustan Zindabad! Hindustan.
So Amulya Lele was arrested after Bangalore police had filed a case of sedition against her. If things were not how they are right now, how would things have proceeded in her case?
So the process is really that you go before a sessions court, and if the session court rejects, then you can appeal before a high court. But if the case doesn't get listed before the sessions court, that becomes a problem. So you have to first get your case listed. And the punishment really here is the time for a case that probably will not stand in court. Like, the charges will probably not be accepted against her because it's just mere sloganeering, right? Like, so it's actually not a case of sedition. So by the time she gets a fair hearing and she gets bail, she would have already spent like 4 or 5 months in jail. So that's one example. We have in the story, we did talk about many other bail cases in serious cases that were sedition and UAPA, that these cases just hadn't come up for hearing, or even if they had come up, they were only perfunctory hearings. So this has been like a huge issue. Although the courts have been saying that they are prioritizing bail cases because they do want to not overcrowd prisons and give bail in as many cases as possible.
There have also been several questions raised about what the role of courts should be at this point. When we talk about, say, the ongoing migrant crisis, there the government's handling of it has been criticized. Many people have not got rations. There hasn't been enough transportation arranged for them to go back home. There have also been problems inside the Shramik special trains, delays, lack of meals. And while all this is something that the center and the state governments are supposed to handle, the question has been whether the courts should step in and do something about it. So could you talk about the role of the judiciary in the time of such crisis, and in what way have they stepped in and in what way they haven't?
So whether there is a crisis or not, you have a right to move the High Courts and the Supreme Court under the Constitution for enforcement of fundamental rights, which is in the case of Supreme Court, you go to court under Article 32, and in the case of High Courts under Article 226. And the courts do have a duty to ensure enforcement of fundamental rights to all citizens. So many of these cases that you would see, especially in a public health emergency, would concern cases of either government mismanagement or, in a sense, checking arbitrariness or violation of fundamental rights. So for enforcement of fundamental rights, of course, you look towards the court. It's a separate debate on what the contours of that court intervention should be, whether they should be stepping into the shoes of the executive and to what extent. Those are debatable things. But the right to move to court, that exists in the Constitution. But what happened in the Supreme Court for the first 3 or 4 weeks was that the court did have a very hands-off approach and said these are for the executive to look into. And in most situations did accept the government's word at face value and did not question. So, for example, Solicitor General Tushar Mehta said in court that as of 11 p.m. that day, there were no migrants on the road, despite multiple news reports showing that migrants were walking thousands of kilometers across the country. So these were the instances which basically called the Supreme Court into criticism. In contrast, high courts had been hearing a lot more cases. Also, because most of these issues sometimes are very localized and have a stronger impact in those regions, it's easier for high courts to intervene. From testing to the Shramik trains, organization of Shramik trains, a lot of these issues were being dealt by high courts. In a report that we had last week, as many as 19 high courts are currently hearing cases which are in one way or the other related to COVID management. So to give you an example of how it becomes a fundamental rights issue is that the Karnataka High Court characterized the question of who is paying for the fare of the migrant into a fundamental rights question. And the court basically asked a question something like this. They said, if some states are willing to pay for their citizens to get back, and some states are not paying, and the center does not interfere in this process, would that not be a violation of a citizen's right to equality? So wouldn't that be an arbitrary categorization of which migrant gets to pay for his own ticket and which migrant can have his ticket reimbursed? So these are some critical questions that the courts have been asking across the country. Kerala, Madras High Court, Andhra Pradesh High Court, all of them have passed detailed orders for the states to comply with regard to migrants. Early last week, we had the Supreme Court take up the same issue. They took a notice on their own, and the court is now hearing this issue all over again.
Right. So last week, when the Supreme Court was hearing this matter on the migrant distress, it also passed an interim order that no fare would be charged from migrants and that they should be provided with meal and water, and that the states and railways were supposed to take care of that. And in this hearing, you also had the Solicitor General of India, Tushar Mehta, arguing the government's case. And it is what he said in this hearing that created a lot of controversy. Could you talk about what he said and why that became controversial?
So the Solicitor General basically hit back at some of the senior advocates who were intervening. So like I mentioned, this case was taken up by the court's own motion. So it was a suo motu case. Although some lawyers, some senior advocates, including Kapil Sibal and Indira Jaising, wanted to intervene and present their own arguments in court. So here it was that the Solicitor General, who was representing the central government, raised certain objections, and he said that these senior advocates should first prove their credentials, and went on to ask Kapil Sibal what he had done, to help the migrants. So it became really a war of words, and the Solicitor General's remarks on these issues, like, for example, he talked about the role of journalists as vultures, and he in fact went on to quote the example of Kevin Carter, the South African journalist. And then another significant line was that he said some high courts are running a parallel government. So he was referring to interventions that the high courts have made on the COVID crisis. That includes, like we said in the report, 19 high courts almost. And the interesting bit was that the Supreme Court bench did not have a line of question for the Solicitor General. They didn't object to these statements being made of accusing high courts of running parallel governments. So that really was the talking point in that hearing.
Next, we talk about India's GDP growth rate. On Friday, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation released the data for the fourth quarter of the last financial year. It also released the provisional estimates for the full year GDP growth rate. It said that the Indian economy grew by just 4.2% in 2019 to 20. This is the lowest the growth rate has been in almost a decade. And this growth rate, barring perhaps the last week of March, is before the coronavirus outbreak and the lockdown. So, it has almost nothing to do with the current economic crisis. In this segment, we speak to Udit Misra, who writes on the economy for the newspaper, about this growth projection, how we know the government did not see this coming, and why that is a problem. Udit, what does the GDP growth projection that has been made by the Ministry of Statistics and Programming Implementation tell us?
So for last financial year, which was 2019-20, which ended in March this year, the government has come out with the provisional estimates for growth. And these provisional estimates suggest that Indian economy grew by 4.2% in the last financial year, that is 1920. And there is a sharp deceleration in growth, as some of the listeners might remember that in 2016-17, we grew the fastest in recent years at 8.3%. This, incidentally, was the year when we had demonetization. And since that year, every financial year, the rate of growth has been decelerating. It has been slowing down. So next year in 17-18, we grew by 7%. The year after, that is 18-19, we grew by 6.1%. And now 19-20, the provisional figures are 4.2%. Now, there are two other things related to this assessment. One is that this number has been steadily coming down, but this is also being seen as an overestimate. And most estimates for the current financial year suggest that there'll be an actual contraction, and a significant one at that, something like 5 to 10%, which is to say that the total amount of goods and services produced in the country will be 5 to 10% less than what they were produced in 1920.
Okay, so like you mentioned, like this growth projection was of last quarter. It had nothing to do with, the current economic crisis that has befallen on us due to the coronavirus pandemic. And in the budget last year, the growth rate that was projected was almost twice as high, which means that the government was not, actually expecting this to happen. What kind of problems can such a thing cause when the government is not in the know about how the GDP growth rate will be?
So there is a problem in the way the government has gone about projecting growth rates in India. So last year in July, when the government made a projection that the economy will grow by 8 to 8.5% in real GDP terms, it was, in my opinion, a faulty exercise because the economy was decelerating right through 2018-19. And even in 2019-20, the first quarter GDP data was very poor. And it was very clear that the economy was slowing down. But the government, instead of understanding the problem that the economy is slowing down, they kept pitching and hoping that the economy will actually grow at 8.5%. And where this created a problem is that, they were reacting to an economy which actually didn't exist because they were hoping that the economy will keep going faster. But as now data is showing, with each quarter last year, the GDP growth rate decelerated progressively. So in first quarter, we grew at 5.2%. And then in the next three quarters, we grew at 4.4, 4.1, and now 3.1. And even these numbers, there is this expectation that they might be revised downwards. So a part of the problem is that the government has been unwilling to accept that the economy was slowing down. And we were making these points last year repeatedly. You might recall in the podcasts and pieces that the economy is actually decelerating faster than what the government is accepting. And as a result, the policy choices were also incorrect. And now when we look back at things like a corporate tax cut, it was a good policy, but it was wrongly timed and hence a wrong policy in that sense. So the whole understanding of the economy was wrong in that sense by the government.
A lot of these estimates that we're talking about could be a result of an overestimation, and there have been questions raised about GDP estimations themselves, that we don't have enough data to make the correct projections. What are the kind of issues that lie in estimating GDP in India, and are there ways to resolve those issues?
So there are two aspects to this. One is that, and this is very important for listeners to understand, that last year's financial year's data, GDP data, gives us a very clear picture of where Indian economy was before COVID hit us, in a big way. The disruption started, the lockdown started only in the last week of March. Now, there are two issues with overestimation of GDP data. One is the long-standing problem now. For a few years, it has been said that India's GDP data is overestimating the growth. Now, that is a broader problem, and we are seeing massive fluctuations in the growth estimates from one assessment to another, which is to say that, as we have done in these provisional estimates also, we have revised downwards the growth for first quarter of last financial year. Now, a lot of people are asking, how do you revise the first quarter growth so dramatically? Some revisions I can understand because the data keeps coming, better quality data keeps coming, and we revise that. But massive revisions have been happening. So one is a long-standing problem. The other thing is that even in the last week of March, the government and RBI announced a lot of moratoriums, a lot of regulatory forbearances, like extensions to, say, filing of financial details by companies and stuff. Now, what happened was that even though the lockdown happened only in the last week, when these moratoriums and extensions were provided, companies did not file all detail. So when you are estimating data, GDP data, you did not have as much information as you typically would have had. What seems to have happened is that, and this is the reason why a lot of people believe that there is an overestimation, is that there have been some assumptions made that GDP would have grown at this rate. But the actual reality is that it might have grown lower, because all the leading indicators like production of cement, coal, steel, most of them are very weak. And that is why a lot of people outside the formal estimation exercise expect that overall numbers would be lower than what these numbers are suggesting. So that's broadly what has happened. Because we do not have all the data because of the moratorium, we do not know for sure whether the economy really grew by 3.1%, because this 3.1% for the last quarter of the last financial year, that is January to March number, is quite high. Nobody expected the economy to be growing at 3.1%. Some people actually even expected the economy to be contracting just between January and March. There has to be some kind of as I think Soumyakanti Ghosh from State Bank of India has also said, there has to be some white paper on how we are calculating the data. Secondly, the quality of data has to be improved, and that's a long-standing issue. The COVID impact, where we said that there should be moratoriums or extensions, that is something that is temporary, and I think that part would be resolved as soon as we get back to a normal schedule of filing details. We'll get back to that, and actually, as soon as we get back to that, you'll see a lot of these variables shoot up. NPAs are likely to go up. A lot of companies will show lesser profits, because we have basically broken the thermometer. We are not mapping what is happening in the economy right now. We're keeping the eyes closed. We're saying, let it pass. Let this storm of COVID pass, and then we'll see. We'll assess who's where. But what is happening in the interim is that the economy is actually slowing down. Businesses are suffering. That reality hasn't changed.
And in the end, we give you an update about the coronavirus outbreak in the country. India has now become the 7th worst hit country by the pandemic. Yesterday, the health ministry said that the death toll rose by 230 and the number of cases rose by 8,300 in the last 24 hours. Yesterday also saw the beginning of the 5th phase of the lockdown. In this phase, previous relaxations have been continued and new ones have also come into effect, like openings of malls, hotels, restaurants, and places of worship from the 8th of June. This phase also comes with permissions for businesses and industries to resume. Recently, in an edit, Indian Express's bureau chief Ravish Tiwari wrote that it will now be up to firms to decide the level and schedule of operations to ensure the health of workers is not compromised. And with these relaxations, individuals will have to be conscious of the risk associated with the gathering of people and to adhere to new behavioral norms, not only to protect themselves, but also their friends and colleagues. Meanwhile, some of the country's leading public health and community medical experts had last week criticized the government's handling of the pandemic. Among these experts were also two members of the COVID-19 research group at the Indian Council of Medical Research, or ICMR. The criticism came in a joint statement that had been made by the Indian Public Health Association, Indian Association of Preventive and Social Medicine, and Indian Association of Epidemiologists. The statement said, and I quote, "It is unrealistic to expect that COVID-19 pandemic can be eliminated at this stage, given that community transmission is already well established across large sections of subpopulations in the country." Unquote. It is important to note that the government has maintained that there is still no community transmission. The statement also says that India's nationwide lockdown from the 25th of March till the 30th of May 2020 has been one of the most stringent, and yet COVID-19 cases have increased exponentially through this phase. The statement reads, quote, "This draconian lockdown is presumably in response to a modeling exercise from an influential institution which was a worst-case scenario. Subsequent events have proved that the predictions of this model were way off the mark. Had the government of India consulted epidemiologists who had better grasp of disease transmission dynamics compared to modelers, it would have perhaps been better served." You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show, as always, was edited and mixed by our producer Joshua Thomas. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.